HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents Mr. B, George Balanchine's 20th Century, by Jennifer Homans. Read by Cassandra Campbell. Why we use words. You know why? To communicate with somebody else, you see. The real life, the real reality, it's not on earth. It's what we cannot explain with words. You would never abandon things on earth, so that's why you don't get anywhere. The portals are open for you, but the passage is narrow. I believe in the moment. I believe in that moment. I believe what I see. The importance of the dance is the person. Choreographer doesn't exist. He suggests. Ballet belongs to a dancer that is now, at this moment, in front of you. George Balanchine. Introduction. Dead Souls. This, the suffering, the grit and hardship of everyday life, never once appeared in Balanchine's dances. It did not interest him. It was pedestrian, a degradation of the human body and spirit. Even the dead bodies in his ballets were set against a backdrop of eternity and had a sense of spirituality and redemption that elevated the body out of the ordinary. Dead bodies, yes, but really dead souls. These were bodies purified and transfigured by the disciplined practices of ballet. And if loss was a theme in his dances, so were love and full-fleshed joy. He made many gorgeously costumed ballets that built to a crescendo with colorful kaleidoscope patterns of dancers synchronizing ever more complicated and demanding rhythms. These were fantastic entertainments that lifted audiences into the great good humor of being alive. He saw himself as a musician and theater man, traveling ballet master, and he had worked in great opera houses and touring troupes. From the Russian Tsar's Mariinsky Theater of his training and youth to the Paris Opera, Broadway, Hollywood, and his own New York City Ballet, NYCB, which he co-founded in 1948. He said he was a showman, and like the old Commedia dell'arte performers, he reinvented himself many times. He seemed ageless. For his dancers, even at the end of his life, Mr. B was a god, and they surrendered their own young lives for a chance to dance his glorious ballets. There was some part of him that did not think of himself as mortal at all. I am not a male. I am water and air, and I am servant. Or, I am a cloud in trousers, he said. A phrase borrowed from a poem he had learned early in life by the Russian poet Vladimir Mayakovsky. Some of the dancers who knew him best secretly called him the breath, another word for spirit, really. What this suggested, and it was a central theme of his life, was that he felt like a man with two bodies, and he lived in them both simultaneously, with, at times, heartbreaking personal consequences. The first was the trousers. The earthly man delighted by sensual feelings and desires, who loved good food, fine wine, beautiful women. He devoted his life to dancing, and everyone said that in rehearsals, even in his old age, he was more physically animated, expressive, and alive than any of his astonishingly athletic and youthful performers. The cloud or breath was something else, and he saw it as the source of his gift. It wasn't mind, exactly. It was more a physical inwardness, and at moments he could appear strangely detached, almost androgynous or asexual, like an angel who knows everything but feels nothing, a servant bearing dances to the gods, an airy floating spirit, elusive at times even to himself. He lived through his dancers. He was not like Mozart or Einstein or Picasso, working alone to change the way people hear or think or see. He needed dancers and a whole theatrical enterprise, but dancers above all. His gift didn't exist without them, and the most disoriented moments of his life were those when he found himself alone and unattached to dancers. He had to have them, and he gathered them and shaped them, making his own paints and pigments from their flesh and blood, meticulously reading and sculpting their minds and bodies. Making dances was personal, psychological, intimate even. They liked to say he knew them better than they knew themselves, and because women were his primary material, and because he was a man who loved women, sensuality and love were always a part of it. For a genius, Balanchine felt small. Maloros, he called himself because he felt undersized. And as a child in Russia they had called him the rat for his persistent facial tic, a kind of nervous sniffing and twitching under the right eye as he spoke, almost like a visual stutter. He sketched himself in childlike drawings at the end of letters he wrote to lovers as a tiny mouse in the company of a large female cat that he fed and nurtured. In his mind's eye, he was that man-mouse, mighty mouse, a flourish at the bottom of the page, and he didn't imagine himself as particularly attractive, though women found him sexy. The mouse was like the cloud or the breath, something a bit secret in their midst, a watcher scurrying around in his mind, preparing great delicacies for his dancers and audiences to enjoy. In reality, he was not small at all, but physically quite average. Average height, average weight, average proportions. He had fine dark features. "I am Georgian," he liked to say. And his Caucasian roots were visible in his dark almond-shaped eyes, pensive and inward in portraits but lit and expressive in life. His forehead was high, and he had a delicate but large straight-edged nose, bigger is better, that became his signature feature in the sketches of his face in profile that he used to sign letters. Only his hands were fleshy and muscular, perhaps from playing the piano, which he did almost daily for most of his life. He liked to work with his hands, cooking, but also carpentry and gardening. He could be found at the local market, carefully touching and testing for firm cucumbers or the perfect tomato. Smells mattered, and once he could afford it, perfumes were a routine purchase for the women dancers he admired, a different scent for each. Appearances mattered too, and he had a dandy's interest in clothing and dress. Pictures from his St. Petersburg youth show him with a dramatic flair, hair slicked back in a Byron-esque sweep, with dark eye makeup to emphasize the point. Later, in Europe, he favored Italian suits and bow ties or colorful foulards, and he loved his American Western-style shirts with string ties and a turquoise flourish. In the studio, it was a simple shirt, neat slacks, and flexible jazz or street shoes, and everyone remembers how he would roll up his sleeves as he entered the room, a sign that the work was about to begin. He took a personal interest in costume design and could be seen bent lovingly over a swath of fabric or absorbed in adjusting a headdress, and he always insisted on the finest materials for his dancers. These sensual delights came against a backdrop of hardship and privation. He had experienced cold and starvation as a child in revolutionary Russia, his skin covered with pus-filled boils from malnutrition. The fear of gnawing hunger and the acrid smell of dead bodies piled in the streets in those early years never really left him. He had a weakened constitution. He was struck with tuberculosis, TB, as a young man, and soon after his arrival in the United States in 1933, he suffered mysterious epileptic-like fits and recurrences of TB, leaving him with a collapsed lung and narrowing left chest. Hardly a year passed when he was not suffering or seeking medical help for some real or imagined ailment. Another source, perhaps, of his feeling small and vulnerable, but also part of his enormous stamina and determination to enjoy life's pleasures and, above all, to make his dancers perform to their very fullest. "What's the matter with now?" he would say. "You might be dead tomorrow." But really, it was all something of a secret. How Balanchine made his extraordinary dances, and how the New York City Ballet had come to be, nobody quite knew, and nobody could quite say. In the early 1960s, Balanchine wrote an unusually terse letter to his associate Betty Cage, asking her to please turn down a request to write his biography by a journalist he didn't particularly like. "If he wants to know about my inspiration or who is my muse," Balanchine wrote, "then he will never know that, because I won't tell him, and it is not going to be written anywhere for anybody to know." There was something urgent in the secrecy, and Balanchine built walls around his gift and walls around his company, as if there was some kind of magic spell that might be broken by exposure. By the time he died, the company was not just a company. It was a kind of secret society, a utopian community with its own elaborate rituals and taboos. And they were all members, monks and angels, mute scribes and devotees of Balanchine's art. Family secrets were never divulged, not because they were ugly or incriminating, though some were, but because the secret was part of the power. It was part of what they were all doing there together. "If they knew," he once said, "they would think I was crazy." Other than the dancers, Lincoln Kirstein, brilliant, huge, troubled, mad, loyal Lincoln, was the only one who understood, and they didn't talk about it either. Americans like to see Balanchine in their own 20th century light. Wasn't he making ballet modern, abstract, 12-tone, and progressive? And weren't his dances icons of speed and urban accomplishment, ornaments to freedom and innovation? The State Department sent the company out on Cold War tours, and Balanchine went. I am an American, but the sight of communism sickened him more than they could imagine. Russia was probably the deepest disappointment he had ever known. He had seen and suffered the way communism could turn words and reason to wood, and he had set his own path away from the materialist Bolshevik revolution that had violently interrupted his childhood and seduced his native land. And so there he was in New York City, quietly building a village of angels and erecting a music-filled monument to faith and unreason, to body and beauty. It was his own counter-revolutionary world of the spirit, an alternate vision of the 20th century. Balanchine himself was a kind of secret, too. Restraint and civility were his natural disposition, and he was a deeply private man. The mask came naturally, at birth, perhaps, but was fixed over years of history and experience. As he built the NYCB up around himself, he withdrew more and more inside. No drama, no tempers, no pretense, a simple craftsman at work daily. Even his use of language was secretive. He was a sophisticated linguist and spoke Russian, German, French, and English. He loved wordplay and puns and wrote limericks, many of them erotic, and romantic song lyrics. Yet although he lived in the United States for 50 years, he spoke a strange pidgin English that was extremely expressive, but impossible to pin down in its winding syntax. It was brilliant but eccentric, hidden, foreign, part of the mask, and also a way of still being Russian, not Soviet, but his own Russia, of his own making. He wasn't an intellectual, W.H. Auden had rightly observed, but something more, a man who understands everything. "I have been alive for a long time," Balanchine would later say, and he did know a lot, read a lot, but he held all of that to himself and dispensed it patiently in thin streams to reporters or dancers or curious outsiders who blankly ignored his digressions into the finer points of fairies or the afterlife. He conserved energy, temper, ideas, concentrated them in an increasingly dense and inner world that had fewer and fewer outlets as he aged. By the end, the only real problem he faced was the one he and his dancers had made together: how to live in the real world when the unreal world of the stage was so much more alive. He didn't think about it much. He focused on music, the grounding and floor of his life and dances. He read books, he played the piano, he absorbed, he cooked, he gardened, he liked carpentry. He ironed his own shirts and could be seen through the window of his apartment in the early morning hours with a towel around his waist, ironing alone. He washed cars, and he made ballets. The rest was left unspoken. "It is all in the dances," he said. But it wasn't, quite. Russia. Chapter 1. Happy Families. When Georgi was born one cold January day in 1904, he was his mother's first illegitimate son. It was official. He was number 160 on the list of newborns at the Church of the Nativity on the Sands in St. Petersburg, where Maria Nikolaevna Vassilieva had dutifully registered his arrival. On this critical document establishing Balanchine's existence in the eyes of God and the Russian state, his father was absent, and his mother, the authorities noted in a neat hand, was Orthodox but unwed. The problem was not only that Balanchine came into the world in a half-fallen bastard state, somehow discredited from the start. It was also that without a father, Georgi had no patronymic, and without a patronymic, his entire genealogy was in doubt. Who was he, even? His older sister, Tamara, born 2 years earlier, was illegitimate too. Ditto his brother, Andrei, who came a year after Georgi in 1905. On Tamara's document, illegitimate was even scrawled like a scarlet letter in bold capitals under her name. Had Maria's children been born in Western Europe, they might have held some rights through their mother. But this was Russia, and the children automatically took the legal status of their father. The sad fact was that without a paterfamilias, none of them had any legal standing at all. They hardly existed. There was only one way back into the social and political fold. In special cases, usually with influence and money changing hands, a child might be legitimized ex post facto by imperial consent and the word of the Tsar himself. A cramped note in new ink amending Tamara, Georgi's, and Andrei's birth documents tells us that this is exactly what happened. On March 18, 1906, the district court legitimized the birth of each of Maria's 3 children, and on September 23rd, the church recognized this change in status too. It was all verified for anyone who cared to look in document number 13025. When Georgi was later asked for his birth certificate, he was able to present an official dictum, birth certificate number 5055, grandly stating that by imperial decree at the St. Petersburg County Court of the 7th District, and acting on a decision from March 18, 1906, it was hereby affirmed that Georgi Melitonovich Balanchivadze had in fact been born to legally wedded parents, both of the Orthodox Christian faith, and both married for the first time. His father, it was proclaimed, was the hereditary honorable citizen Meliton Antonovich Balanchivadze. Stamps, signatures, office duties paid. This administrative sleight of hand may have normalized Balanchine's birth, but it did nothing to change the facts. If Georgi's parents ever did formally marry, no record has been found, it was not, at least in Meliton's case, for the first time. When Georgi and his siblings were born, Meliton had a whole other family. A wife and 2 children back in his native Georgia. Many years later, Balanchine would wistfully tell his first biographer that this unnamed and faceless first wife, whom he never met, had died, and that his father had been a widower. But she hadn't, and he wasn't. The matter was serious, if not unusual. There were growing numbers of illegitimate children in St. Petersburg in these years, as peasant women, scarves wrapped tightly around their heads and carrying their belongings, fled their villages for new opportunities in nearby urban centers. Marital traditions loosened their hold on these and other urban mothers, townswomen, craftswomen, women filling jobs in businesses and factories. Georgi's mother perhaps among them, who found themselves at once independent and vulnerable in new ways. Official shelters called angel factories even paid 2 rubles per head for abandoned babies in an effort to absorb the increase in children left by their often struggling and unwed mothers. Even for those with the advantages of rank or wealth, the consequences could be serious. Illegitimacy precluded the inheritance of family wealth. Pierre's problem in the early pages of Tolstoy's War and Peace. Alexander Herzen's problem in Life. Wealth was not a Balanchivadze problem, at least for now, and nobility was out of the question. If you are noble, Balanchine later said, you always want to find out where you come from. My French so-and-so, my mother was so-and-so. But they were simple people. Nothing. Not important. And so, at the moment of birth, there were already complications, uncertainties, revisions, and pasts that would never quite reveal themselves fully, or that later took on the aura of secrets and blank spaces in his mind. Balanchine may not have cared that he was officially illegitimate, or known that his parents later maneuvered to correct the record, but it was a fact of his parents' lives, and children always absorbed their parents' facts. Balanchine never had the confidence of his past, and when he looked back down the long corridor of his life to that distant point where it all began, he saw only shadows and vague outlines. I don't know, he would say when pressed, winding his voice around the question and trying to find something to fill the hole in his mind. Thus emerged the first truth of his life. The bedrock was sand. Meliton Antonovich Balanchivadze came from a clan of state peasants in the rural enclave of Banoja, just outside the small town of Kutaisi in western Georgia. You can go there today and meet the Balanchivadze descendants still living there, and see the sprawling graveyard of Balanchivadze ancestors buried in fenced outdoor plots, each like a miniature home complete with a small graveside table to make visitors comfortable, since talking with the dead was part of life. You can read in the church records going back into the 19th century that Hosea was the father of Otya, who was the father of a monk and his brother Kaihosro, who married Tula, and together they bore Balanchine's grandfather Amiron. The family were peasants, but they were rising, and this very Amiron pulled himself up from the unglamorous business of soil and dirt in one of the only ways possible at the time, the Russian Orthodox Church. He managed to attend seminary in Kutaisi and become a parish priest, a deacon even, and part of the white clergy. so he changed the Georgian Amiran to the more Russian-sounding Anton. Others in the family joined the more ascetic black clergy of celibate monks, the ancestral monk to begin with, and later an uncle whose investiture Balanchine would witness as a child. Anton married a local peasant girl, and together they produced Meliton, the first of several children, only 4 of whom would survive. Meanwhile, Anton was becoming something of a local leader, and his parishioners were apparently so partial to him that they built in his honor the small gray stone church of St. George, which sits high on a hill overlooking the cemetery and the village. Meliton was raised down the hill and across the dirt road in the shadow of St. George, and at the center of what was then a small and impoverished farming community. It mattered that it was St. George, who would be little Georgi's patron saint too, and this modest church is the only firm structure that ties Balanchine to that dusty place in his family's past. St. George, whose image Balanchine would keep near him in icons all his life, lost his mother at age 10 and devoted himself to brave military feats in the name of God. In his martyrdom he was Christ-like, and is said to have suffered tortures including a caustic lime pit, iron hooks, and being crushed by stone, broken on a wheel, and burned with a torch. An angel often protected him. St. George famously appeared in paintings and icons, riding a white horse and radiating light as he speared an evil dragon worshipped by terrified pagans, and saved the beautiful maiden they had offered in sacrifice to this vicious beast. The maiden then led the dying dragon to the town center, where St. George slew it for all to see, a performance that freed the damsel and her people and brought them to the Christian faith. The village of Banoja sits in the narrow valley of the Rioni River, near the town of Kutaisi and some 143 miles west of Tbilisi, at the foot of the Greater Caucasus Mountains. The Caucasus are the highest range in Europe and stretch from the Black Sea to the Caspian Sea, setting Kutaisi, Tbilisi, and the whole of Georgia dramatically, at times violently, apart from Russia and its capital of St. Petersburg, where Balanchine would be born and raised. Some thought of Georgia as Russia's southern Siberia, since the only way in from the north was over a perilous military highway with hairpin curves through a rocky and beautiful wooded mountain pass, a region romanced in tales by Pushkin and Lermontov. Since the early 19th century, the entire region had been forcibly incorporated into Russia, and its diverse, fractured, and at times warring regions ruled by the vast and Byzantine administrative structures of the Tsar. From the imperial point of view, there was no such thing as Georgia, and the censors forbade even the use of the word, at least in Russian. Education was in Russian, not Georgian, which has its own beautifully ornate alphabet, and the church was the Russian Orthodox Church, not the far more ancient Georgian Orthodox Church, with its deep pagan influences and ties to antiquity. This was the Georgia that Meliton was born to, and as a child he naturally began walking his father's path. He had been baptized in the nearby Kutaisi Cathedral, and, like his father, he was educated at the Kutaisi Seminary. His grades in all subjects, Russian, Latin, Greek, arithmetic, and spiritual history, were low, and although he went on to the more prestigious Tiflis Theological Seminary in Georgia's capital city at the age of 14, he soon dropped out and returned to Kutaisi to marry Gayane Eristavi, a local girl from an old but impoverished noble family. The couple had 2 children, Nino and Apollon, and for a moment Meliton appeared set to continue on the family path through a life that would end in the little Banoja cemetery under the Church of St. George with his ancestors all around. As it turned out, however, this was only Meliton's first family. Balanchine belonged to Meliton's second Russian family and a whole new life.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?